It's not often that we have people back 2 years in a row, but Daniel so captivated people last year by pursuing this effort to reconcile the 6-day version of creation as it is depicted in the Old Testament with the 13.7 billion year old universe that is measured by modern cosmology. So we have him back because he's just published a new book, a companion piece to his first one, which was called Genesis 1 Code, and he continues in an effort to uncover and to demonstrate the important relationships between scientific theory and biblical teaching. Have a look at this.
Hello. Thank you, Moses, for having me back at Idea City. I'm sorry to be here electronically. One of the oldest and deepest questions we have been asking ourselves for a long time is, how did we get here? What is the story of human origins? Like most deep questions in today's day and age, we have two seemingly contradictory answers, one from science and one from religion. So, are we a divine creation less than 6,000 years old, as the Bible seems to suggest? Or did we evolve over millions of years until 200,000 years ago, when our species, Homo sapiens, appeared in the planet? Are science and the Bible completely incompatible? Or can they actually agree on what events happened and when they happened, and only disagree on how it all happened? That is the question we'll be exploring today. But we're not the first. The so-called creation-evolution debate, or origins debate, has been going on for about 200 years, and it has reached all walks of life, from politics to what should be taught in schools. Recently, there's been a generational gap develop, with the Zoomers siding with this religion side of the answer, and the 18 to 25-year-olds siding with the science side of the answer. Nonetheless, the polls suggest that the vast majority still believe God had something to do with human origins. So let's put the how aside for a minute and focus on what happened and when it happened. Indeed, if we look at the record, we see that science has determined, not from theory, but from actual observation of bones and human remains, that we appeared 200,000 years ago in Africa. We behaved at that time like animals, and it was only 100,000 or so years ago that we behaved what we would call modern human behaviors. That means we had developed the ability to come to Idea City, because modern human behaviors are all about speaking, and speaking about complex subjects like envisioning the future or concepts, not just observation. Meanwhile, the Bible posits that we were created in day 6, according to its own chronology, 5,773 years ago. Furthermore, the Bible goes on to tell us a bit of our early human history. It says that we left the area of the world and spread throughout the whole world. Science has in fact also confirmed this remarkable human journey out of Africa to every corner of the planet. But once again, the timeline doesn't fit. Science posits the out of Africa migration at 60,000 years ago or so, whereas the Bible says it happened about 4,000 years ago. So in order to grasp all this, we need to review the scientific record more closely and the biblical record more closely. Let's start with science. In science, we have a tremendous amount of information, again, not from theory, but from direct observation, from the fossil record. The fossil record, or the whole buried remains of human and human-like species and artifacts, contains a tremendous amount of information, not just about anatomy in terms of the bones, but the artifacts that we leave behind, the tools that we leave behind, and other information in the buried remains shows some of our behavior. and we can infer behavior and eating habits and so on. Add to this the new science of genetics, DNA analysis, where we can do the DNA analysis of all existing human populations as we have, and existing ape populations, in particular the chimpanzee, which is our known closest relative, and even DNA analysis of buried remains up to 50,000, even a little bit older remains that contain DNA that is still being preserved. And you can put the whole scientific picture of what existed, when it existed, and to a large extent how it behaved together. So what does this picture actually show? It shows a series of human-like species over a period of millions of years, culminating in Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago. Now, these species that have been uncovered over the last 20, 30, 40 years and analyzed and actually fueled the debate some more, they show by and large a progression from what are considered ape-like features to human-like features, for example, from small brains to much larger brains. Although at times they show a complete dead end, and actually in the last few months we've discovered that perhaps there's some regression to smaller sized brains again. The story is still being put together. Surprisingly, all of these species are now extinct. Only we survived, and the chimpanzees was our last common ancestor with. Furthermore, when we study the behavioral evidence in the fossil record and the DNA, we discovered that only us have these modern human behaviors. And we only have them for the last 60,000 years, perhaps for the last 100,000 years. For the first whole half of our existence, we did not have these modern behaviors. Now, we take these for granted, but being here today with you, speaking about a complex concept and breathing at the same time, which we take for granted, is actually completely unique to our species. Now, once we develop these modern behaviors, we get up from Africa and we travel throughout the whole world. This is a remarkable journey that has been planned out by science and takes a tremendous amount of ingenuity. I like sea kayaking in the west coast of Vancouver Island, and today in a fiberglass boat with a radio that gives me a weather report and a sea state report every hour and a GPS, a 1-week trip is a significant challenge. Yet our ancestors seem to have traveled to Australia and all the way down from Alaska to South America, mostly on water. Quite a remarkable journey. So that is the scientific facts as we know them today. Let's turn to the Bible. Now, Genesis is a very short narrative, a few thousand words, that tells us all about our human origins, and you would think that doesn't really tell us a lot. But luckily in the Jewish tradition, the written tradition is accompanied by the oral tradition, which expounds significantly on what is going on in the written tradition. And when you add these two together, you get the Torah. The Torah, of course, contains Genesis. It contains a number of other texts it shares with Christianity, like Psalms. And all in all, when you look at human origins in the Torah, we are talking thousands of pages. So we can get a really good idea of what it says. Now, what does it say? Let's start with anatomy. The Bible is very clear in the text that our bodies are formed, and they're formed pretty well, as you can see from the quotes on the slide, almost in the identical text as animals. In other words, our bodies are made just like the animal bodies. The word formed is a very important word. It means that existing materials were used and the laws of nature were obeyed. You took existing materials, used the laws of nature to form the body. In other words, the process of making our bodies is exactly what science would describe in science. So we should understand it very well through science. Furthermore, the sources are very clear that there's a progression from animal to ape to human, with the ape being an intermediary, something that contains characteristics of animals and characteristics of humans. Now, you go further into the biblical literature, you find out that sometime later, we'll discuss when in a minute, a soul is breathed in to the human. Breathed in means not form, it means it comes directly from the Creator. It's a completely out of nature, completely inexplicable by science phenomena. And we're told very explicitly what that soul comes. It comes with language, speaking, and it comes with the modern human behaviors. It comes with free will. It comes with an amazing creative process. That is the biblical story of how that happens. If we go deeper into the sources, we're given very clear explanations of what those elements that come kind of from below, understandable by science, are, and those elements that come from above, which are completely uniquely human. This is from very old sources, well before we had studied this even in animals, let alone in the species that have since gone extinct. Now, so far, I haven't made much of a distinction between Adam and humans, but there's a big difference. The main one I want to focus on is spiritually. Adam had the soul breathed into him. He contained a supermassive soul, the soul of all humanity. And the sources tell us that when he sinned, that soul broke. And it broke into over 200 billion pieces that were to become the souls for all of humanity ever since. So each one of us has today a piece of that soul. So as we can see, we have actually a progression in the Bible that starts right in microscopic life in the ocean, goes to animals, goes to apes, goes to humans, and then goes to a soul being inserted into a human to make it a modernly behavioral human. All of those seem to match the events of the fossil record in science very, very well. But what about the timeline? The timeline just doesn't fit, right? Now, last year I spoke at Idea City, and I spoke about the biblical timeline, and I'm not going to go over it again, but I was able to show that there is a formula or a scale factor in the Bible that tells us what a creation day is. Just like when the Bible says God's hand, it doesn't mean one of our hands. When it says a creation day, it doesn't mean a 24-hour day. The biblical time scale says that a day is 2.5 billion years. Now, when you apply the scale factor to Genesis, and you compute the time from in the beginning till today, or the time from the beginning of day 5, when first life appears in the oceans, until today, you can calculate a dozen or so events that correspond to cosmology and science perfectly in terms of our cosmology and animal history. Now, what happens when we apply this to humans? You apply exactly the same formula. We don't have time for it today, but you apply exactly the same formula. You consider what the Bible calls a moment. It's a very special period of time over which we make a moral decision or a moral act, and we're given the exact time for a moment. And then you consider the creative process of humans, which are made in the image of God, which means that we have the same creative process as God, which is a 4-step process corresponding to God's 4-letter essential name. First step we're all very familiar with is the instantaneous flash of inspiration we get. The 4th step we're also familiar is the actual action, in the case of Adam, eating the fruit. You go through these 4 steps, you do them all in a moment, you convert the time 2.5 billion years per day, and you get an exact timeline for when humans appeared, when the body appeared, when they became behavioral model, when the soul came in, and so on. And when we put that whole timeline together and compare it to science, we get an exact agreement. We agree that 200,000 years ago, the anatomy of the human appeared. 120,000 years ago, the souls from Adam began to be incarnated. By 63,000, they had finished incarnated. At that point, we were modernly human from the souls. Those souls all came with a command that was given to Adam, which was, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And in fact, that's what science confirms. We left Africa, we go fill the whole earth. Those souls also came with the shame of clothing. We had not been clothed until that time. And then we go on to clothing. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have time today, but if you go through the whole early history of the flood and Babel, you can continue on with human early history from the Bible. You have to understand that the flood story and the Babel story are local stories to a specific set of people, unlike the normal interpretation. And you get a match of right to the European languages and English that we speak today coming out from that whole process. So in short, we have a very good agreement on the timelines. So let's step back now and conclude. If you look at the two bodies of knowledge, one developed thousands of years ago, one very, very modern, new information every day. They both agree on what is unique about humans, and specifically they agree that there's a progression from microscopic to sea life, to land life, to ape, to human. And the Bible sees that progression, of course, as a design effect of the whole creation process. Science explains that progression through the theory of evolution and random mutations. But we agree on what happened and when it happened. Both bodies of knowledge agree that we have very unique human behaviors, not available to anything else. They're uniquely human. Science is still trying to develop a consensus how that happened. Is it just our intelligence, or what is it? We don't really know. The Torah is crystal clear. It's an out of science or an out of nature development from God himself, and it comes ready-made with all the things that we need and that we experience in modern human behaviors. Both bodies of knowledge agree very clearly, as I've shown you, on the timeline. Obviously, I have to give you a lot more detail. It's all contained in my book, The Broken Gift. You can now guess where the broken comes from, the broken pieces of Adam and the gift, the soul. But you can see right there that the timeline matches. So where we end up disagreeing is on the how, and in particular we disagree on the nature of the soul. In fact, we don't even know from a science point of view if a soul even exists. But we have a very good agreement on what happened, when it happened. I hope I have shown you that you can learn a lot from the biblical side of the story and, of course, from the scientific side of the story. You can put them together, and now you can go forward with this reconciled set of stories and have your own look about the how, the part we don't yet agree, and hopefully we'll get there. Thank you very much.